Welcome to Season 3 of Creative Solutions for a New World Climate and Artists series. I'm Frances Littman, your host. I'd like to gratefully acknowledge the Coast Salish people of this region and First Nations worldwide. For thousands of years, the abundance that these lands and waters provide us to live, work, and play is due to the reciprocal relationships by which Coast Salish and the world's first people have lived and live today. To bring us together in the spirit of today's webinar and the importance of old growth forests and biodiversity, I'd like to share a poem by Douglas Lewis. Step into the old growth forest, where the towers mob the sun with their rails of bark in rising and boughs of green in run. A melee of mosses, a free-for-all of ferns, and the haunting snags of hollow ghosts with charcoal in their veins. We'll answer questions live closer to the end of the program, and introducing our guest today will be our esteemed climate and the arts partner, Jonathan O'Riordan. John is a former Deputy Minister of the Environment, and he's dedicated to supporting climate action and the arts while honoring his late wife, professional cellist Gail O'Riordan. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Frances, and thank you very much for your opening poem and these wonderful images. These are all your images, Frances, and I think people need to know that you're a fabulous photographer and you're bringing the arts into this lovely Climate and Arts series. It's my honor to introduce Kathy Code, who's been working with a number of citizens in British Columbia to prevent some logging in old growth forests in Fairy Creek, which is a watershed in the San Juan Basin, about 150 kilometers west of Victoria in southwest Vancouver Island. This is an old growth forest, very, very precious in terms of biodiversity and values. The top end of Fairy Creek has got very important old growth timber, and it's subject to logging by Teal Jones with a license. But Kathy and her group have been setting up some blockades to peacefully prevent some of that logging, and Teal Jones has asked for an injunction in the courts to remove the blockade so they can start logging. And I'm going to pass it to Kathy to talk about what's the status of this injunction.
Thank you, Jonathan, for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation to appear here. The Rainforest Flying Squad has been busy protecting the old growth forest in Tree Farm License number 46 since August of 2020. We've lived through the fall and winter months of snow and sleet and rain, and have recently been served with an injunction from Teal Jones, who want the camps removed. We appeared at the injunction hearing on March 4th to ask for an adjournment because the Rainforest Flying Squad hadn't really had an opportunity to prepare. We were very honored when Madam Justice provided us an adjournment of 3 weeks and a 2-day hearing then to present our case. We feel this is an amazing opportunity we've been given then so that we can present our case publicly and so that people can hear our story and what we're standing for. And I'd like to emphasize too the fact that we are not anti-logging. We are fine with logging in the second growth areas, but we know that the old growth areas, there's so little of it left, and what remains has to be protected because once it's gone, it can never be renewed. Old growth is not a renewable resource.
Thank you, Kathy. That's going to be emphasized too by our next speaker, Jim Pojar, and he's going to be talking about the importance of old growth for storing carbon as part of our road to carbon neutrality. So, Kathy, I see you've got an honored guest that you're meeting with. Can you introduce your guest and talk about the role that he's playing in helping you win this case?
I'm very honored to introduce Pachadat Elder Bill Jones, who has been with us right from the very beginning, attending all the camps, being very much a part of this movement, and up to now being very much a sole representative of his band. So Bill, perhaps you could talk to us then a little bit about your involvement at Fairy Creek and what your role has been there.
Hello, my name's William Jones, yes, and I'm from the First Nations. And yes, our political infrastructure, the band council, seems quite agreement or passive to the logging, particularly in our old growth. And I'm not in favor of that for our future's sake, our children's sake. In my youth, I used to be in logging, and when I was 16 years old, and I worked on an operation called a skidder, which is a complex line system of getting logs all the way from the tops of the mountain to the valley. And I was on top there, and we were in the tops of mountains, and it was so pristine and romantic there that I just couldn't forget it. It was sort of welded into my soul. And I was 16 then, and that was the glory days of logging, where we were all expecting our rites of passage to be a logger. And that was our youthful rites of passage in them days. And that only lasted from about 1956 till about 1984, when what I call it the grim reaping days of logging, where the huge major volume of our forests along the BC coast were ruthlessly extracted for lumber use and pulp mill. So we were sort of accepting to logging practices. We were tough loggers, and we were told that the logging will last forever. And that was on October 14th, 1984, and there was a couple 100,000 loggers laid off in BC, including mill workers and that. So we were despondent and shocked to be told that we likely will never come back to the woods. Or actually, the personnel manager said, come back in 300 years.
Oh dear.
And
Oh my goodness.
that was a sad, sad experience for me. And it sort of changed my attitude to logging. And now I'm still in my active mode. And now I'm more convinced than ever that we have to save this last stand of what we used to call virgin forest, and now we call it old growth, but it's the same. My grandfather used to tell us not to go up to the tops of mountains or anywhere where there's large trees unless you go there for spiritual purposes and to pray and meditate. Along with the creeks off the major rivers, we were told that and exhorted to use them as cleansing places and for spiritual purposes to keep our souls in the right stance to be able to approach our great mother. And we would then go up to the tops of the mountains and start a fire, or usually just pray and meditate. But actually my experience was that we never thought of it as a prayer and meditation thing. There was no strict ritual or liturgy to or any way to approach our great mother. We were simply going up there to be quiet, and she will tell us what she wants us to do and what she will give us. And that was finally sunk in when the logging died out and I was laid off forever to menial and make work jobs until I got my pension.
It's a tremendous, a great amount of information, Bill, and I was just so fascinated listening to you because it's such important information, and it really tells us how you have interacted with the forest over your lifetime. Can you perhaps talk to us about what it would mean to you if the rest of the old growth is cut, and what it would mean to the next generations of Pachadat children to come?
Oh my, it would be a total destruction of self. The colonial experience for my people was via the Indian Act and the residential schools was destructive to our language and culture. And we are now in the phase of where we are now restructuring our identity of self. We were starting at the school at school age, at early childhood training. They call it pre-kindergarten, and we have a child identify the child's self and his name and where he's from. We were taught not to identify ourselves as our people, and that we were not quite a person, but not really recognized as a effective individual. And we were left high school confused about our personal identities, and that is crucial in our experience in the forests and in the creeks, where we created ourselves via the peacefulness of the forest and the messages that we got from the forest and the creeks. And that was crucial in our culture, I think, because it gave us our language, and it also gave us our song, and all our decision expressions were usually made in song. We would come back and we would sing about what we have decided to do. So our interaction with the forest was whole, in that we brought the forest to the ocean, much like maybe the carbon cycle does the same thing now, that I've just mulled over lately. And I realized that now, that in fact we're part of that circle of evolution, and that we were in fact a part of this world, a natural being in a natural place that was endlessly abundant. And I feel that the decimation or the destruction of the last of the old growth will be a final insult to our children. And I think that to let that pass in my feelings is that no. So I really feel committed to help save what we have left of the old growth for its spiritual purposes, to our children and to all mankind, really, because the most of the people that are up there now, except for me, are Caucasian, and they were called there via, I think our great mother does that to people. She will call people from places.
We certainly are very fortunate to have you, Bill, spearheading this movement. It's really grown into something quite significant, with hundreds of people involved in attending the camps, surviving through the fall and winter months in the snow and the sleet and the rain, which couldn't have been very easy, and all of the people who are organizing behind the scenes, and all the people who are providing us donations. We've reached well over $100,000 in donations now. So that's, a significant show of support. And we have communities demonstrating on our behalf all up and down the island. So, I mean, this has really morphed into something fairly significant. And our thanks to you, Bill, for hanging in there and being a point of inspiration for this whole campaign.
Thanks again, Bill. It's a wonderful story and wonderful sense of how you and your folks enjoy the old growth forests and how much they mean to you culturally and spiritually. But Kathy, I think we should cast our mind back 30 years, as Bill noted, because there were similar protests back in the early 90s. in Clayoquot Sound, where a group of dedicated people, both First Nations and non-First Nations, blocked the roads and just protested the clear-cut logging that was going on, and dramatically changed the way we log in BC as a result of that. So it's quite clear that in British Columbia, we have a history where a small number of dedicated people can have an enormous impact on the future of forest management in this country, in this province. So, Bill, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation and the importance of forests to you and your people and your children. And we wish you the very best in your work to protect the old growth forests in Fairy Creek. And Kathy, thank you for your leadership in taking this injunction on, bringing this to the public attention, engaging a large number of communities. As I mentioned before, we've had situations in British Columbia where small groups of people have completely changed forest policy by their dedication to protect values in the public interest. So congratulations to you both, and we wish you the very best in the future.
Thank you.
Such words of wisdom. Thank you. Yes, Bill Jones, Kathy Code, and John. So based on what we've just heard, it seems only fitting to quote Charles Darwin. Among the scenes which are deeply impressed on my mind, none exceed the sublimity of the primeval forests. No one can stand in these solitudes unmoved and not feel that there is more in man than the mere breath of his body. John, would you like to tell us about our next guest, Jim Pojar?
The overall series about road to carbon neutrality, and in British Columbia and also worldwide, forests have a huge role to play in terms of carbon management, both as a carbon sink and as a carbon source. So our next guest is Jim Pojar, who is a forest ecologist, worked for the BC government for many years and has done an enormous amount of research in the way forests trap carbon and release carbon. And he is being my next guest to talk about what is the future of forests in BC with respect to carbon stewardship, and what roles can we play in making sure that these forests become permanently carbon sinks rather than carbon sources. So good morning, Jim. Very nice to see you on Climate and the Arts and talking about the very important subject of how carbon is managed in British Columbia forests. I'm fairly well aware that the carbon management in forests is a very complex topic. There's a lot of biology and ecology associated with it. There's also been a lot of change over the last several decades in terms of how forests are managed and what kinds of climate conditions we're seeing with wildfires and beetle kills. So can you tell us a little bit about how forests and carbon have changed from being a carbon sink to a carbon source over the last several decades?
In our BC forests, we had a sink, a carbon sink, for many years up until 2003, 2004, when the red line crossed the line. It went from being a sink, which is represented by the green bars, and above the zero line, into becoming a source of greenhouse gas emissions. So what caused that? Well, there were some big wildfires like the Kelowna fire in 2003. And some others, and then back in the early 2000s, and then the mountain pine beetle epidemic commenced, and that was from 1999 to 2015, but the peak of the beetle was 2004. So that's 2003, 2004, the red line starts to grow up.
Can you explain to our audience, because we have an international audience, what is the pine beetle? What damage does it do? How did its ecology change with climate over the last several decades?
And the mountain pine beetle outbreak happened partly because of climate warming. In the past, the central interior of BC used to regularly get periods of weeks below -3 or even -40. And that was enough to kill the larvae of this beetle in the pine trees. The beetle bores into the trees and it lays its eggs in the wood, and they must overwinter. And if it gets really cold for an extended period of time, they don't survive. So 1800s, 1900s, there were also periodic pine beetle outbreaks, but they didn't really last very long because of cold winters. The other factor was forest management in the sense of fire suppression. So in the past, wildfires would have regularly broken out and burned a lot of the interior forests. But because of pretty effective fire suppression since 1950s or so, there was a lot of susceptible host in the form of mature pine trees by the time the year 2000 rolled around.
So now we have
So,
examples of large-scale pine beetle kill. So how does that affect carbon output, and what's also affect how else are these fires we've had in the last 2 or 3 years changing things?
so the graph, the green bars represent the net growth in BC's forests, and that's the figure of the primary production, that is the carbon captured by the trees through photosynthesis, captured and stored in the forest, minus decay. The reason they got shorter and shorter is primarily initially because of the pine beetle, because a lot of trees died, they lost their living needles, and so they were no longer capturing carbon, they were no longer photosynthesizing, no longer growing. And so the net growth declined, and it's remained relatively low up till now, because there's still lots of dead trees out there in the forest. But where the real jump happened then was 2017, 2018 especially, when we had the big wildfires in Caribou-Chilcotin and the Lakes District, and even in places on the coast in Vancouver Island. That's where it starts to skyrocket, because those were huge fires and they gave off hundreds of thousands of greenhouse gas emissions.
Are you predicting, because if we assume that climate is going to continue to change, we're going to have drier and longer summers, more erratic rainfall events, is it quite possible that we'll get more pine beetle outbreaks over the next 20 or 30 years, and secondly, we can expect more intense and extensive forest fires, which is going to start to accumulate the level amount of carbon that's being emitted from our forests, all other things being equal?
Because of the general climate warming in the province and the projected degree of it, we will have more of these big wildfires, although there's a limit to that, because a lot of the forests have already burned. There's still big areas of fire-prone forests, especially in the boreal areas and the high elevations. But the more noticeable trend may be more larger fires. Not that they'll become necessarily more frequent, but they could be more extreme. Nonetheless, that doesn't mean that all of British Columbia's forests are going to disappear overnight or in the next 20 years. Some of them, especially those that are growing in cool, moist climates like coastal forests, temperate rainforests, some of the interior rainforests, and at snowy high elevations. Generally, they're much less likely to host big landscape level wildfires. Although if fire weather becomes really extreme, virtually anything will burn.
Okay, cool. Let's turn our mind to old growth. As you know, we've been focusing on the importance of old growth earlier in this webinar, and some of the folk who are trying to protect the last stands of old growth on Vancouver Island and elsewhere. So can you tell us a little bit about the importance of old growth in terms of storing carbon and what you see that value should be in the way we manage and protect old growth going forward?
Mature and old growth forests, in terms of the carbon budget of BC's forests, these old stands are the most important with respect to storage of carbon. They're also taking up carbon. Annually, that's a relatively low amount compared to the billions of tons of carbon that are already stored, sort of the standing crop in the forest. All the forests in BC, the total storage is around 18 billion tons of carbon, many times more than the province's annual emissions of greenhouse gases. In fact, it's around 1,000 times BC's annual emissions. And logging this old growth results in severe losses to this carbon storage. And the natural climate solution to mitigation would be to keep as many of these old growth forests standing as possible, because they have these huge amounts and they're also less likely to fall to wildfire or bark beetles, that sort of thing. Some of them will definitely be around in the decades to come. So we need to hang on to them while they're still there, and especially in the next 30 years, you've got to hang on to them. The most productive ones are the ones that store the most carbon in the trees and on the forest floor and in the soil. So those are the ones that are also rare. They've become rarer and rarer, and the province seems to be intent on liquidating them as well.
What do you see are the solutions for carbon stewardship in our forests? So as we enter mid-century, we're going to be carbon neutral.
Well, there's several things that we can do to protect more of these old carbon-rich forests that have a good chance of being with us for a long time. And that means the old growth of the temperate rainforest, the inland, and also other forests like subalpine forests in snowy climates. They're the ones that are less likely to burn down or get wiped out by the bark beetles. Additionally, if we can, we have to try and at least manage these catastrophic wildfires, which requires a landscape level approach, trying to create a mosaic of stands that aren't uniformly susceptible to wildfire. But that's a big, complicated issue that needs addressing on several levels. One level that we need to reduce is that of the global annual cut, which has been too high for decades. In other words, we need to log less, or at least log sustainably. Somehow, we have to reduce slash burning. The previous NDP government said they were going to do that, but they haven't. One way would be to extend the carbon tax to slash burning. I'll tell you, that would change things in a hurry. Also, if you manage the commercial forests on extended locations, just the fact that they're around for a longer time, like not 70 years, but maybe 150, they accumulate and store much more carbon. And do more partial cutting and less clear cutting, especially in primary, mature, and old forests. You don't have to clear cut everywhere. In fact, we shouldn't be doing the same thing everywhere. And we have research and operations that show that this partial cutting can be done, and you can make money doing it. But it's actually the amount of it done has declined in the province in the last 10 to 15 years. And of course, we have to continue planting trees, take up and remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, especially in these big areas of wildfires. And that's not to say that they're all going to get planted, because some of the burns occur in very inaccessible areas. But and in some of them you can leave for natural regeneration. Others need planting. And any new cut blocks need to be reforested as quickly as possible.
Thanks, Jim, for a very interesting interview. What you're showing us is that the forests of BC have now turned from being a carbon sink to being a carbon source, and that this is continuing to be a challenge as we face potentially more wildfires and possible beetle kills. So we have to start to change the way we manage our forests by A, protecting old growth that has so much carbon storage in it, and B, reducing the amount of wildfire damage and slash burning, and C, changing the way we manage our commercial forests so we have carbon as a central component of our stewardship and not just industrial logging. So it's been very, very important information you've provided us, Jim. Thanks very much for your insight and your discussion, and all the best to you and your research and your work going forward.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Jim. Wow. And now for these words by Anton Pavlovich Chekhov. A tree is beautiful, but what's more, it has a right to life. Like water, the sun, the stars, it is essential. Life on Earth is inconceivable without trees. Forests create climate, climate influences people's character, and so on and so forth. There can be neither civilization nor happiness if forests crash down under the axe. John, let's welcome our next guest, Tori Stevens.
Thank you again, and thank you for your wonderful images. Beautiful, Francis. So our next guest is Tori Stevens, and she worked with the BC Ministry of Environment for a number of years as a conservation ecologist, and she's primarily focused on the role of parks play in terms of biodiversity, climate change, and adapting to a changing climate. So welcome, Tori, to our show. It's lovely to see you.
Thank you, John.
I have a number of questions for you. One is on about biodiversity in parks in general. How do parks help us adapt to climate change? What role does biodiversity play inside parks?
Well, sometimes I think of the conservation of biodiversity and adaptation to climate change as the same thing, but of course they're not. But biodiversity is so fundamental to human life that if we're going to successfully adapt to our future, we must make sure that we maintain the ability of as much biodiversity as possible to get through the rapidly changing period ahead of us. This is going to be a period of instability that we've never seen before. Since we know that there's a built-in lag time in response to the climate to the greenhouse gases that have already been produced, we can expect serious changes in the future, no matter how vigorously we manage the carbon now. And how the natural world is able to respond to those changes is going to play a large part in our future well-being. At the most obvious level, I'm talking about species and the communities they form with all their interactions. This is the biodiversity of the present. But the key to future biodiversity is in the genetic level. Having a diverse gene pool provides much more potential for successful adaptation to future conditions. Alarming information about the reduction in wildlife populations has recently been published by the World Wildlife Fund. On average, the decline has been 60% since 1970. This has enormous implications for the gene pool. The biomass of wildlife has been replaced by the very limited gene pools of domestic animals. Adapting to climate change is about keeping as much stability in our lives as we can manage as we go forward. The foundation of this stability is biodiversity. If we can keep as much genetic material as possible so that species can evolve and ecosystems can reconfigure, then we have done our best. There are other ways that individuals adapt to changes in their environment besides genetic. And when I say individuals, I mean plants and animals, not necessarily us, but us as well. And this is where parks come into play. Adaptation can also be behavioral. Animals can move by taking advantage of nearby microclimates that are cooler. They can move uphill or they can move north. Parks and other natural areas have a huge role to play in providing the space and the diversity of microclimates to buffer the impacts of climate. Where we designate parks, how much of the land and water is protected for biodiversity, and how we manage the areas within and outside of protected areas will contribute to the ability of animals and plants to find a viable place to live and to leave offspring. Parks that are large, well-connected, and represent all the available ecosystem will provide the best outcomes. We're coming to a general understanding that to maintain any reasonable level of biodiversity, we need to protect between 30 and 70% of the land and water and leave it relatively undisturbed from industrial activities and heavy human use.
So, Tori, I think you're aware that the federal government the Canadian federal government has endorsed a general shift towards conservation of up to 30% of the land and water base to be protected over by the end of the decade, by 2030. And I believe we have something closer to 20% of our land base currently conserved in biodiverse areas and parks or indigenous protected areas. So how do you see that shift towards 30% helping us to deal with climate change as it accelerates in the future?
It's absolutely essential. And as I just noticed, it's the low end of what scientists think is the amount of land and water that is going to help us protect biodiversity into the future. And Canada has made the commitment after the UN said that 30% should be our goal. Canada signed on to that, as did the United States. But we need more than just the expanded area in order to protect biodiversity. We need to have it be well connected, and we need to have it represent all the underlying ecosystems that are in the province, so that every organism has a chance. And then on top of all of that, we need to be extremely mindful that the Indigenous peoples of this province have been here for a very long time. They have a close relationship with places and the organisms that live here, and they need to be consulted at all levels of this planning and brought into the process.
So I think we're encouraged, Tori, because you and I both know that the provincial government has recently hired a very high class specialist in nature's biodiversity, and is got a mandate to negotiate with the federal governments about ways in which both the federal government and BC can combine on nature agreements that expand biodiversity in the province. So what is your thoughts about whether we need to manage these areas, or can we just get out of the way and let the natural system manage itself?
Well, just briefly going back to the hiring of Karen in this new position, she oversaw, or didn't oversee, but she was very central to the doubling of the park system in the 90s. And I think we need to double the park system again in order to get to a reasonable level of protection for land and water. But to get to your question, the key thing about wildlands is that they do very well if they're left to their own devices, but people have a very difficult time doing that. They love to be in wild places, and they exert a tremendous influence on them. And I acknowledge that for millennia, the Indigenous people interacted and often shaped the land around them. And what we see today is the result of that relationship. And I think that should be maintained. But to have tremendous numbers of people going into wild areas will definitely have an impact. But recreation and moderation is definitely compatible with wildness. When trails erode, when people drive motorized or non-motorized vehicles into wild places, they can disturb herds of animals, particularly important in winter. Camping, if it's overdone, can destroy habitat. So we definitely need to manage people more than we need to manage the land. But on top of that, there'll definitely be a need for management for restoration. I think it's going to be very difficult to find 30% of British Columbia that is well connected and well represented without bumping into some lands that have already had some pretty extreme disturbances. And also rewilding is a concept that has become quite, it's come to the forefront in both Europe and North America. And this is where countries are trying to reintroduce carnivores into areas that used to be wild. And it's all about connections and carnivores and conservation. In BC, we are in a very good place. We have some of the last intact predator-prey systems on the continent. And we would have to do very little in the way of reintroducing animals, but still we need to be cautious and have enough land, and it has to be well enough connected so that our carnivores don't disappear. So managing protected lands is one focus, but managing the lands in which the parks are embedded, so the areas around parks, is also very important. Buffers around protected areas where minimal disturbance is allowed will soften the edges. And these softer edges keep this functional size of the protected areas the way we expect them to do. If we have a hard edge on a protected area, it's too easy for the influence of roads or industrial activities or even microclimates to cross the borders and shrink the functional size of these protected places. And ensuring that nature has the space to evolve will require, we recognize, a whole new level of government investment in land and water. So not only do they need to purchase land and plan and manage it appropriately for the public to reduce human impacts, but they have to support community volunteer efforts and other citizen involvement, raise awareness about boundaries, monitor ecological changes, and all these things are expensive. So much more government funding is needed. Land management agencies in BC have been starved for funding for decades. And this has got to change if we have any hope that our ecological systems are going to continue to provide us the 24/7 services that we expect of them, and that will improve our personal health and long-term survival along with the survival of all the other organisms that combine and interact and make up the biodiversity of this province.
Well, thank you, Tori, for your wonderful exposition of biodiversity in a park system. We have a world-class park system in BC. We're very proud of it. But you're giving me hope that we have a person now in government who has got a mandate to expand that park system, work with the federal government in finding additional funding sources to make it work. And remember, we have an agreement with the First Nations under the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People to work with them collaboratively on the values and spirituality that they put on the land base and are so well expressed by Bill Jones. So I've got a lot of hope going forward. Thanks again, Tori. Back to you, Francis, for Q's and A's.
Well, that was fabulous. Thank you, Tori. And I'd like to welcome Bill Jones and Kathy Code. Both have joined us so they can answer Q&As, which we'll be going to in just a second here. But I just, there's Bill, there's Kathy. Great. I just wanted to be sure everyone had a chance to be on. Welcome. And thank you so much for that excellent presentation, Bill and Kathy. So we have a number of questions and for all of you. I'm going to start with you, Bill, if you don't mind. We have a question about whether you would share with us your relationship to the rest of your nation. That's a big question, and I'm not certain, but I guess is there tension between the elected band council and the hereditary chief? Are people in agreement with what the work you're trying to do?
Oh boy, my relationship with the politicians, the band council, has been rather strained for a long time, about 20 or more years, because of my concern about the environment and our land use, in particular our use of spiritual places, where my grandfather pointed out that the Fairy Creek ecosystem was a holy place where we left undisturbed, except for prayer and meditation up there, much the same as the upper Walbrand, and also actually there was use in other places that has just been rediscovered. So I better get back to Fairy Creek, and actually we used to call it Granite Creek also, is now Renfrew Creek. Those two systems go into the Fairy Lake, which was an important sockeye source for our people. In my boyhood, we used to harvest about 500-600 sockeye from the slough in front of Fairy Lake that accesses the San Juan River. We used to camp there, and as a boy, I'd wake up in the morning and Mom would be barbecuing sockeye over the fire. And I remember asking, well, how many did we get? And we used to average about 500-600. Now, after logging started there, it just died right out. It's recovering somewhat now, but still not as not in good numbers. So the food source there was important, and also along with Fairy Creek, we have there used to be sockeye going up there, not in big numbers, but also coho and pinks were actually spawning by the what we now call the campground there. So it was an important food source. Actually, our food sources were so vast and varied that we really never occurred to us that it could be destroyed. But in fact, just a little bit of logging up Fairy Creek and not Fairy Creek, but up Granite Creek there did huge damage to our food source, along with sort of defaming. It's sort of like when you follow the trees down in a creek that you have been praying at and meditating up in the forest. It's sort of an insult, and took our desire to be there and pray in a clear cut,
Oh,
You can't,
understandable, Bill. Yeah. Kathy, and Bill, perhaps, Kathy, you could share with us how best can we support the Rainforest Flying Squad, this, wonderful group of people that are the hero workers saving our forests. Could we put something in the chat box for everyone to see where the website is, and or their Facebook page, how to support it? I'm going to just take another question. David Spence has asked, saving the old growth is extremely important. He's beginning to think that trees have a lifespan that needs to be respected. Well, yes, definitely. What needs to be added to the saving trees is an extensive program of planting trees for another generation to know the life of trees, even 300 to 500 years from now. What's happening to plant new trees for future generations? Can anyone answer that question?
As you know, I'm also associated with the Ecoforestry Institute Society, and we hold Wildwood in title, are trustees of that on behalf of the people of BC. Wildwood has never been replanted. Merv Wilkinson, the previous owner, began harvesting in 1945 and never planted a tree. He depended entirely on natural regeneration. So when we do harvesting, we look at the forest, at the light, at the age and species of trees around a potentially harvestable tree, and the soil and the nutrients and the habitat. We look at all of those factors and before we decide to cut anything. So we do not do anything other than natural regeneration.
And what about a variety of species so that there's not a monoculture? Can you just speak to that for half a second, the importance of that?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. And if left to herself, Mother Nature will do the job. Mother Nature does an amazing job of ensuring that the right thing gets planted in the right place and that it will thrive there. If it doesn't, it dies and something else will take its place. But I think if you let Mother Nature do the job, you have the whole cycle of life happening with I'm sure a lot of things going on that we have no idea about how they work together.
Absolutely, because the increase in jobs that would be possible as well if the forestry was regenerative and community managed could be significant. The way we're going about it now is backwards, as we know. So there's a question. I'm going to turn this over to Tori. What is the name of the specialist that the provincial government has hired? A lot of people are asking this question.
Her name is Karen Lewis.
Okay, there's another question here, Tori. What kind of infusion of money is needed to ensure that BC parks can properly manage their biodiversity?
Oh, there's so many ways to answer this question. One way we could figure this out is to compare the amount of money that BC spends per hectare compared to other park systems. And we are woefully behind, sometimes a factor of 10. And we currently spend about 40 million, I believe. It would be a guess, basically, but I would say, since in the time that I worked for parks, we never adequately managed them. And we would need to have at least 4 times that much. If we had 10 times that much, it would be fantastic. So it's not only just for hands-on work on the ground, but just having more people to monitor what's happening, both to watch how people are recreating there, but also just to monitor the changes in the natural world. And there's a lot of ways that we need to improve and how to spend money. And of course, if as I'm advocating that we double the parks system again, it's going to be that much more land that has to be patrolled and monitored.
So lots of jobs there. So when we hear
lots
about
of jobs, lots
there's
of money.
lots of great jobs to be had out there. So what I'm
And
going to suggest,
hopefully lots of saved old growth forests. I mean,
absolutely,
what Jim wants to do and what Bill wants to do and what Kathy wants to do and what I want to do all converge in having more protected land.
So when governments talk about jobs, this is what we need to tell them back. These are the kind of jobs we need, rather than falling silent and letting them tell us what kind of jobs they're going to provide, maybe. I think what we could do here, because there are quite a few questions about, could we provide some contacts and links to where people can contact some of these key influencers. So perhaps I'm going to suggest when we do our video replay, we'll have that with the video replay so people can find that. There's another question here. Bob is asking, what is the suggestion as to how do we influence the NDP government to stop absolutely cutting any more old growth trees? He says, I've written several letters and even met with local MLAs and am encouraged by the report to stop the logging, but the government has not ended it. Suggestions, please.
Well, I believe that our action at Fairy Creek and within TFL 46 has certainly captured the government's attention. We'll be appearing in court March 25th and 26th to respond to the injunction. The judge has decided it is in the public interest to hear that. So I think that's an amazing turn of events for us. But I've heard that Minister Conroy has determined it will take 3 years for her to consult with First Nations. And by all means, First Nations absolutely need to be invited to the table. But we don't have 3 years of old growth to spare. So, the government's approach to talk and log, they promise all of these recommendations and everything. But I have heard from municipal channels as well that the government plans to implement those recommendations over a 10-year period. We don't have a 10-year period to do this. The action needs to happen now.
Right. We have a lot of questions, and I'm really sorry, we're not going to get to them all live, but what we are going to do is approach our panelists to answer these, and we'll post them with the video replay. Since we're running low on time, I just want to thank all our beautiful panelists for your wisdom and knowledge keeping. Thank you for sharing. And just a reminder that please do support the Fairy Creek Defenders and our parks, and also check out the mountainroadforest.ca website. This is another area of need of protection. We have until Earth Day to try to save a beautiful 49-acre urban forest from development. And you'll get a chance to be entered into a draw for a Tofino getaway package that also includes a fabulous signed piece of art by Roy Henry Vickers. John, why don't you tell us what's in store for our next webinar on March 24th?
Well, I was actually going to do a quick summary of what we've agreed to.
Yes.
So there are 4 goals that government is working on in terms of dealing with old growth going forward. One is to help the economic recovery following the pandemic. Secondly is to advance reconciliation, which Bill talked about so eloquently with Indigenous folks. Third is to adapt to a rapidly changing climate in our forests and our waterways. And fourthly is to advance conservation and stewardship. And on the short term, we think there are 4 actions. One is that there has to be a shared decision-making framework created with Indigenous nations as part of our commitment to working together and collaboration. And secondly, the government actually has committed to protecting more old growth areas. It's part of its mandate for this new government. It was sworn in last fall. And so we need to work out where are the areas of high biodiversity that need to be protected immediately, and how can we make sure that we retain old growth in our forest mass going forward. Thirdly, we have to get better science so we understand exactly what is old growth and what is critical to be protected, because there's some differential in that between various scientists. And finally, we have to set conservation targets through our nature agreements with the federal government to make sure we protect but also restore forest systems. But on the longer term, clearly we need a forest carbon strategy, which will make sure that forests in BC retain themselves as carbon sinks and not as carbon sources. That's critical if we're going to become carbon neutral in BC in the next 30 years. We have to raise the level on which we plan our forests from the site-specific to what we call the landscape level, which is combinations of small watersheds, so that we can protect our conservation and, more importantly, make our water resources more secure. Thirdly, we need to have a fair transition plan. And you mentioned, Francis, the amount of jobs that are able to be created through biodiversity and conservation, through workers helping to plant trees and grow our forests again. And we need to transition people who are currently involved in industrial logging to a different type of employment in our rural communities, so we maintain the jobs in these communities. And finally, we have to develop a funding agreement with the federal government that will give us the money that Tori is asking for to provide a really good effort in biodiversity and conservation in this wonderful province. Thank you, Francis.
And we're definitely working on this. And I just, we've still got a few more things to share with you. And one of the things that I love to tell you about is the Forest March. Will be happening on March 19th. We'll be posting some information about that. So John, I have to tell you, our next program is going to be just like, wow. We're going to be welcoming back Mace Rosenstein, a highly respected Washington, D.C. lawyer with an interest in the U.S. Constitution and politics, whose clients include many recognizable media organizations and companies, such as these that you can see. And we have Dr. Andrew Hoffman, an internationally recognized speaker, author, and professor of sustainable enterprise at the University of Michigan's Ross School of Business, School for Environment and Sustainability. And his research, teaching, and writing examines the way that environmental issues emerge as managerial, economic, and political concerns. But he also examines the cultural and institutional dimensions of environmental issues, as well as the reasons why people reject the science of climate change and how we can overcome that resistance. And our Climate and the Arts partner and author and United Nations University Chair of Water and Climate Security, Robert Sanford, rejoins us with a guest, David Fago, a clinical psychologist. So John, just quickly tell us more about this incredible upcoming program.
Well, thanks, Francis. It's called Truth Matters. And normally you would think, well, why would we think truth matters? That's self-evident. But unfortunately, in this day and age, truth is warped by fake news and by people with preconceived ideas. So what we're talking about is, in order to get to a climate neutral future, we need to better align people's visions and perceptions of what is going on in climate change and start to remove some of these falsehoods and hopefully get people to be thinking in a more truthful manner about what science tells us, and we can collectively reach the goal of carbon neutrality by 2050.
Wow, this is a must-see, everyone. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.